If you look at the Harvard study, after all these years, when they looked at happiness, they found that it was not related to income. It was not related to prestige. It was not related to your job title. What they actually found was that it was related to interpersonal relationships, what I would call community and connections.
Hey, it's Rocky. Welcome to Richer Soul. Today's guest is Jordan Grumet, who is back again to chat about living a purposeful life. Imagine it's 12 months from now, and you've achieved your major life goals. How does it feel to be in the best shape of your life? To wake up energized, excited about the day, to have great relationships and friends who support you and propel you forward. How does it feel to have an excess of money, to be able to make the choices you want, to be fearless and open to trying new adventures? Imagine being connected to the universe and it providing everything you desire. It's possible over time, and your past does not dictate your future. The only thing holding you back from this vision is you. It's time to take control of our thoughts and use them to our advantage. Welcome to Richer Soul, where we achieve our dreams and bring balance to health, wealth, relationships, time, and spirituality. If you have not had a chance to listen to episodes 1 through 9, I encourage you to go back and listen to the framework behind Richer Soul and how to create the life of your dreams. You can also find all the show notes for this episode at richersoul.com. I'm going to start today with a quote from Aristotle. Happiness is the meaning and purpose of life, the whole aim and end of human existence. Let's face it, we all want to be happy, and it's a lot easier than you can think. It's a mindset, and it's all something you have to work on. The problem is we're looking in the wrong places or listening to the wrong messages. That's what we're going to chat about today. Jordan's been on twice before, episode 293, where he talked about taking stock as a hospice doctor, and episode 108, where we talked about life, death, health, wealth, and wisdom. Jordan spends his time with people at the end of life. But if we learn from that, we can make sure our end is a life well worth leading and living. Jordan found the spark to become a doctor after a deeply personal event reshaped his life's trajectory. The unexpected loss of his father, an oncologist, ignited a passion with him to practice medicine and instilled a unique vantage point that later melded seamlessly with his financial expertise. It's the convergence of the roles that spurred him to explore profound notions like wealth, abundance, financial independence through a thoughtful and critical lens. He understands both medicine and finance. Let's meet Jordan and learn from him. Welcome back to Richer Soul, Jordan Grumet. It's great to have you join us today.
Rocky, I am so happy to be back with you.
And I am excited to continue to learn from you. So catch us up. The last time you were on, you were talking about your book, Taking Stock, A Hospice Doctor's Advice. And I found in talking to authors after the book comes out and they start having conversations with people, a whole bunch of ahas come from that. So I'd love to hear if you found out anything.
Well, I did. So the book, Taking Stock, was about my experience as a hospice doctor and what it taught me about money and life, because I also lived a life in personal finance as a personal finance expert. I had my own podcast. And really, there was a big premise behind the book, this idea that we should put our purpose, identity, and connections and then before thinking about our finances, and then build a financial framework around it. Well, I went out and marketed my book, Taking Stock. I went to a bunch of conferences, gave a bunch of talks, and the same thing kept happening. I would give a talk and it would be well received, and I would be on my way out, walking away from the podium, and some person would come up to me and they would look angry. And it confused me the first time. I'm like, why are you angry? I thought, I was trying to give an uplifting talk that was, supposed to be helpful for everyone. And it came down to the same thing over and over again. People would look at me and say, I love your message, but you keep on telling me that I need to find my purpose. And I've been searching for my purpose for years. I can't find my purpose. I'm getting really frustrated. And I don't think there even is such thing as purpose. Will you please stop telling people to find their purpose? And after hearing this multiple times, I decided to do some research on my own. And I found two things that seem to contradict each other. First and foremost, the research on purpose in life is everywhere. People have done tons of studies, and there is a clear connection between purpose, health, longevity, and happiness. So people who tend to have a good sense of purpose in life tend to live longer, be happier, and generally be healthier. On the other hand, other studies show that up to 91% of people have something called purpose anxiety. The idea of purpose causes them stress or distress or depression. And so for me, this was a big paradox. Like, how can purpose be the most important thing and yet be anxiety causing? This made me really question my experience as a hospice doctor, question my experience as a financial podcaster, question my experiences as a coach and writer. And I came to the conclusion that purpose is probably not one thing, it's two different things at least. And one of those versions of purpose is probably much more associated with that health, longevity, and happiness. And the other version is probably more associated with disappointment and anxiety.
Did you say 91%?
91%. There was a researcher named Larissa Rainey who actually first coined the term purpose anxiety. And she found that at least some point in life, so that doesn't mean like all the time,
Okay.
but at least some point in life, 91% of people have purpose anxiety.
All right. That makes a little bit more sense with that added part. I was like, wait a minute. If I went and talked to 100 people, 91% of them have anxiety over this right this moment, but no, it's at some point. So, and I can understand that, especially when people are younger and they're still figuring things out. It makes a lot more sense that would be the case.
But it wasn't only young people. I was finding middle-aged people and even older people who were coming to me and they just didn't put a lot of thought into purpose because they had assumed that their families were purpose, or they assumed that their jobs were purpose, or they had made lots of assumptions usually based on what they were required to do in life. And then if they were lucky enough to get to a point where the requirements had decreased, they found themselves lost because there wasn't anything they had to do anymore. And they hadn't done a lot of thinking past, what do I have to do to survive or take care of my family?
So when you say family, I'm assuming you mean kids, or is it bigger than just kids?
I think it's mostly kids, but also parents and also nieces and nephews, et cetera. A lot of people, there are many, many people out there, and I argue against this in the book, who decide that their family actually has purpose. And so they spend a lot of time living for their family, which is great, especially if you have young kids. I mean, you really do want to invest in them and give them your love and support. But guess what happens? You and I both know this. Kids go to college. Kids develop lives of their own. Kids get spouses. Kids have their own kids. And there comes a point where the amount of engagement that you have with your children, they just don't need you as much anymore. And that's where I really see a voltage drop where people are like, oh, well, what's my purpose now? And I think it's sinister in two ways. One is that they actually found that they didn't pursue purpose earlier outside of their family. But the other thing is they've modeled this behavior for their children, that purpose means taking care of people you love, which is wonderful. But don't we want our children to go out and just engage in things that light them up? Do we want our children only to find happiness and joy in their own children? No, we want them to take on hobbies. We want them to do jobs that fill them up, that bring them light, that even change the world. But if you don't model that behavior for them, if they don't see you doing that, why ever would they do it as adults?
And that makes total sense. And I do know, and I notice a lot, this isn't judgmental, it's just stay-at-home moms. And it probably today with a stay-at-home dad, because you put so much time, energy, and stuff into the kids. And then when that phase of life ends, then you're stuck. And the same thing in work. Like people who actually, it happens a lot with doctors, because when you retire as a doctor, you're no longer, like, you may still have the title, but you're not out there practicing medicine, and you spent so much of your life being so focused and ingrained in that. So in corporate, it's like you don't even get the choice. Like one day you get cut off and you're gone. And it's very difficult to make that switch if you have done, I guess in both these situations, it comes down to a singular focus in life and not looking around at the rest of life.
I think we do a really good job of talking to our kids about finances, but we know you can talk to your kids about finances all you want. If they don't see you managing them correctly, they're not going to be good with their finances. We can talk to them all about getting a job that they love, that fills them up, or even that provides enough money. But if they see you going to work and being miserable or not enjoying it or not fulfilling some sense of purpose with it, they're not going to go and do that for themselves. So it's a matter of, modeling that right behavior, I think, and not being forced into kind of that singular focus that sometimes corporate America, or for physicians, sometimes we get stuck in that singular focus and we forget that we're actually supposed to be somewhat filled up by our lives. We get just so patterned into doing this thing that we were supposed to do because society told us we were, or because now it's making money, or because it's the only identity we ever knew. And the idea of stepping away from it is so petrifying, even if that identity doesn't fit us. Look, I was a doctor for years and I had almost no close doctor friends. And it took me forever to realize I was clutching to an identity that didn't even feel good for me. I didn't even see myself as that doctor that I kept on trying to convince myself I was. So no wonder I didn't have any close connections. I was trying to be someone I wasn't and surrounding myself with people who I didn't connect with. It was only later when I started writing and podcasting and communicating, doing all these kind of things, that I was able to connect with people in such a way that I'd go to a conference and meet someone like you, and we'd have a great conversation. I'm like, I feel closer to that guy than doctors I've known for decades.
And, I was just thinking as you were speaking, Olympians, pro athletes, astronauts, they all go after a goal. And the moment they achieve it, if they don't have a glide path afterwards, which in a sense of retirement, kids leave to college, you need your glide path for the rest of life to go to. Otherwise, you find yourself in trouble.
Yeah, and I mean, I talk about it a lot in the book, and we'll probably talk about it here somewhat, but goals can be somewhat dangerous. I think goals can be really good and they can set us on a path, but as opposed to being the guy who accomplishes the thing, I'd rather become the kind of guy who does the thing, whether he accomplishes it or not, right? So I'd love to be a guy who is a New York Times bestseller, but I'd rather be the guy who finds writing to be appealing and loves the art of it and goes out and writes, regardless if I become a New York Times bestseller or not. And so for me, a lot of times the goal gets in the way and we start identifying ourselves by the goal as opposed to identifying ourselves by the process. So I'd rather try to help people become the thing they want to be instead of reaching that one goal, because usually you're not defined by the goal. You're defined by the process. You're defined by the process of becoming and being, as opposed to that few moments where you reach a big goal.
That makes a lot of sense. So, what inspired you to write the book, The Purpose Code: How to Unlock Meaning, Maximize Happiness, and Leave a Lasting Legacy?
Well, I mean, I knew from these studies that purpose, if we had a pill that you could take and you'd live 20% longer and be happier and be healthier, you would take it. On the other hand, we have this thing called purpose. You don't even have to take anything, almost no side effects. If we learn how to achieve some sense of purpose in our life, we get all these wonderful things. And yet, when you go out in the world, you find this group of people, up to 91% of people, sometime in their life, feel this sense of anxiety and fear and worry around this idea of purpose, as opposed to feeling uplifted by it. So I knew there was something there, that we were fundamentally missing something about purpose. And that's why I wanted to go ahead and write about it and offer a whole new view of what purpose can look like.
So, one of the things you talk about in the book, and I think I've heard this a lot and it makes a lot of sense, is big P purpose and little p purpose. So, can you define those for us in the way that you see them? And let's talk about how they're different.
So this was kind of the definition of the two different phenomenon I talk about when I'm talking about purpose. There's one that seems to lead to disappointment. I call it big P purpose, and one that seems to lead to some of these better things that are associated with purpose. So let's talk about big P purpose. Big P purpose is defined by goals. And usually it's big and audacious. I want to become president. I want to travel to Mars. I want to be in Major League Baseball. These things that are very, very difficult to accomplish. I often say that it is scarcity mindset oriented, right? Because not everyone can become president. In fact, only a select few can. Not everyone can be a Major League Baseball player. And a lot of times with big P purpose, we don't necessarily always have the agency to accomplish the thing. So if you think about a lot of these bigger goals that we have, you have to be the right person at the right time saying the right thing. And often you have to have the right genetics too, right? So if I want to be a Major League Baseball player, I got to be pretty good at running and catching, and I have to have good hand-eye coordination, all these things that I might have inherited but might not. And so the idea here is it feels very scarce, right? Winner takes all, only a few people succeed. Little P purpose, on the other hand, is opposed to being goal oriented, is much more process oriented. And so, as opposed to worrying about getting to an end goal, what are the things we enjoy doing that light us up? So, as opposed to being scarcity mindset oriented, this is very abundance oriented. In fact, there's no way to fail. Unlike big P purpose, you either succeed or you don't. With little P purpose, it's much more unfailable. And so, I think when we start setting our mind on things that we enjoy the process of doing, as opposed to on goal setting, we tend to be happier. Now, that's not to say that if you're involved in little P purpose, you can't have some goals, but you have to be somewhat goal agnostic. I love to give the example of podcasting for me as little P purpose. Now, of course, I'd love to have 1 million downloads a year, 1 million downloads a month, but I only have so much agency to change that. And if I decide that my sense of purpose and happiness really depend on whether I get those 1 million downloads a month, I'm probably going to find myself unhappy, especially if I'm not meeting that goal. On the other hand, if I decide I'm going to enjoy myself, I'm going to do something I like, maybe I can even take some incremental steps and learn how to be a better interviewer. Those are things I all have agency over, not necessarily some huge big goal.
One of the things I notice, especially with big P purpose, is people have these big, massive goals. They don't actually take the time to realize what the cost of the goals is. And I mean, the amount of work, effort, what you're going to give up, all of these types of things are all have to be considered. And I don't know that people ever look at that when they have these audacious goals. I mean, if you look at most super highly successful people, I don't know that most of them may not have great relationships with their kids, probably married a couple times. Some of them are depressed, right? It's hard to go out in public and just be a person. Everywhere you go, people are either cheering you or, screaming at you. And it doesn't make it easy.
And here's the thing about it. When you look around at the people who have really accomplished big, audacious goals, many of them aren't happy. I mean, I'm thinking about like the Elon Musks and the Steve Jobs, and even people like Prince and Michael Jackson, these supremely, supremely successful people. It actually doesn't do what people think it will. And this gets a touch complicated, but I think it's the reality. Happiness to me is actually made up of meaning and purpose. They're two very different things. Meaning more has to do with our cognitive thoughts about the past. It's the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, whereas purpose often has to do with the present and future, and it's all about action, not necessarily about thoughts. What I found in hyperachievers is that they're actually lacking in a sense of meaning. The stories they tell themselves about themselves, especially in the past, are ones of trauma and pain and fear, pretty much a sense of I wasn't enough in the past. So instead of going and seeing a therapist and dealing with those feelings of not being enough in the past, instead they try to purpose their way to happiness or purpose their way to enough. And so they create these big audacious goals to prove that they're good enough. Like, I was beat up as a child, but if I go and I become president, I'm good enough. I was poor and homeless as a child, but if I invent this amazing thing or become a partner at the law firm, then I'm good enough. But the problem is, purpose is really about the present and future, and it's much more about action than thought. So often, when these people get to these big, audacious goals, the few people who can, right? So if you don't get to the goal, you're going to be disappointed and feel bad about yourself, have purpose anxiety. But if you do get to the goal and you're really struggling with a meaning issue, it's not going to be good enough. And so you're going to accomplish something. And instead of saying, aha, I got there, I'm now enough and the world is good, you're going to be like, okay, I felt good for a day, a week, a month, but now I don't feel good again. So what is the next achievement? What's the next net worth level? What's the next title that I can achieve? And so it ends up being another type of treadmill that doesn't make people really happy.
They keep moving the goalpost.
Yeah. Well, when you're trying to prove your worthiness by purpose, it never quite gets you there because that's not what purpose does. Unfortunately, it's more meaning. It's dealing with your past that helps you feel enough. But people don't necessarily get that. So they glom onto purpose. And this is why there's so much purpose anxiety out there, is they think all of a sudden all the problems of their past, their generational trauma, their lived trauma is all of a sudden going to go away once they achieve something. And that's not how it works.
You know, it's funny, even with smaller purpose or smaller ideas, and you talk about this a little bit in the book, I suggest people test out their ideas because they aren't always what they think. And I mean, it could be just something as simple as, oh, I want to move south because it's warmer. And my wife thought about that, and my daughter moved down to Texas. I'm like, okay, I guess we can look at moving to Texas. Well, I noticed the temperatures the last 2 summers. I go, we're not moving to Texas.
Too hot,
like,
man.
that's
Too
not
hot.
happening. We might be able to winter in Texas. And even then, the weather's not that great. I'm like, but this isn't it. Or, you know, somebody thinks they're going to go. It's funny. I get stuck occasionally watching silliness on social media. And they had this one post that came up, and this is you and how you think looking like when you get out of the Porsche, you know, and they show a person like glamorously getting out of the Porsche. And then they were like, this is what it really looks like. Well, the car's so damn low to the ground
It's hard to get out.
the person's actually like crawling out on all fours and standing up. And it's like, you know, you thought you wanted X, but it's really not as fun as you thought it was going to be.
You know, here's the thing also about big purpose. I mean, we're talking about the car, even where you live. But when you make that kind of, and you think about those bigger things like the job you want or the accolade you want, part of the problem with that, and people mistake this with big P purpose all the time, is they feel like they have to have this one purpose that motivates and guides them throughout their whole life. Whereas, just as you were saying, sometimes reality isn't at all what we think it is, or sometimes we change and don't fit that sense of purpose anymore. And that's why I like little P purpose a lot more than big P purposes. You know, you can have one underlying little P purpose, or you can have 10. You can be involved in a version of little P purpose for a week, a month, or a year, and then drop it and move to something else. The point is, does the process of doing this thing fill you up or not? And if it doesn't, it's time to move on. When we get tracked into big P purpose, a lot of times we spend years and years and years doing something we don't even like for a payoff that either isn't worth it, doesn't fit us anymore, or we've actually erased our time and energy to do all these other possible purposeful things for this one huge goal that a lot of times, even if you do get there, you might not be that happy. And so, yeah, it's this big mirage. And we kind of put this mirage in place because society told us, right? Society told us we were supposed to be doing something big. Society told us we were supposed to have quote unquote impact. Our parents told us when we grew up we had to do these things and make a lot of money. Influencers tell us we need six-pack abs and travel the world and wear the nicest clothes. Marketers tell us that we won't be complete unless we do X, Y, or Z. What they're really trying to do is create a sense of big P purpose and then co-op any sense of little P purpose you have and replace it with this big P purpose that allows you to spend money on what they're selling. And so we end up being stressed out and anxious. And social media is a perfect example. It drives a lot of this.
It does. And you have to learn to turn it off. And I think it's gotten worse. And they've gotten much better at making it more addictive and building algorithms to give you the things that you might desire to look at, or that you, for whatever subconscious reason, are sucked into. And they know how to do that well.
They're very good at it. Yeah.
They're very good at it. So one of the things you talk about in the book is the life review process. Can you talk a little bit about how this works?
Sure. So one of the biggest problems, whether little p purpose or big p purpose, I, of course, am a big fan of little p purpose, but people specifically say, well, fine, little p purpose sounds great, but how do I find my purpose? I hear this all the time. I don't know what my purpose is. How do I find it? And I often correct them. I say, well, you don't really find your purpose. You create or build purpose, right? It's a very active process. It's about action. It's about present and future. But it is true that we at least have to decide what to build purpose around. And that's what I call a purpose anchor, an inkling, a beckoning, something that feels important to you that you then build the sense of purpose around. So the question is, how do we find these purpose anchors? And in the book, I discuss 4 or 5 different ways to do that. And one of them is the life review, right? So the life review is something we do in hospice, and it's a structured series of questions we do with the dying patients about their lives. What did they accomplish? What did they fail at? What were their biggest moments? Who were the most important people? And very importantly, what do they regret now that they're getting to the end of life? A very quick life review, a one sentencer is basically, if I found out I was going to die tomorrow, what would I regret never having the energy, courage, or time to do? And I really want to point to that word regret, because regret in a dying person is disappointment, right? Because you don't have agency to change things and you're dying, you don't have energy, time, etc. But regret in a young and otherwise healthy person is another name for little p purpose. So regret can be a great purpose anchor to start building the life you want by using that as a tool to say, aha, here is something I can start building purpose around. And so that's one of the ways we find these purpose anchors. Now, there are many other ways, right? One of them is you and I may talk about, is the art of subtraction, is taking a look at your job and saying, I don't like my job anymore. In fact, I one day want to leave it. But are there any things you love about your job? Do you ever wake up one morning a week and you're like, oh, I'm so excited it's this day because I get to do this task or I get to hang out with this person? Maybe you hate 95% of your job, but like 5%. Well, that 5% can be a purpose anchor. Maybe when you eventually get to a place where you can leave that job, you can start building a life of purpose around that anchor. Or better yet, maybe if you're stuck in that job because you don't have enough money, maybe you can start jockeying to take up more and more time doing that thing you like. Maybe you can start redistributing your work or working with your boss or working with your company to change things so that you can start building a sense of purpose within your job around that anchor.
I find a lot of people feel stuck and they don't realize that they have agency to even do this, or they don't even imagine what's possible. It's funny because I was having a conversation with somebody this morning and we were just brainstorming some ideas. And through the brainstorming, it's like, oh, I could actually solve this problem by talking to the person next door to me about XYZ. And I'm like, funny how the answer's been staring you in the face and you never thought about it until we had a conversation. And I said, hey, I'm going to start ideation with you. Yep. I don't know that these are the right answers. They may not be, but all I want to do is get you thinking. And that's what happened.
I find this very, very often. And specifically, I find it when people are talking about money. They say, I don't have enough money, so therefore I can't pursue purpose. Look, I'm working on my 8 to 6. I have no time. This is what it is. Purpose is just something I'm going to put on the back burner. And here's my answer to that. I think we forget that we have 2 things going in our favor. We have a tool set and we have a bunch of levers. And so a lot of people make the mistake that money is the only tool available to them. It's one tool, it's a very powerful tool, but it's only one tool. So for instance, you might have your youth, you might have your energy, you might have your time, your communities, your skill set, your passions. Those are also tools. And then we have a set of levers. And I often talk about 3 important levers. There's the joy of addition. You can add things into your life that are purposeful. The art of subtraction. You can get rid of things that aren't purposeful or that you loathe. Or substitution. When you have nothing else available, can you substitute one thing for another that's slightly better for you? And so when we put this all together, I often talk about that mythical 22-year-old who just got out of college and hates their job, but it's the only way they can make money and they feel trapped in an 8 to 6. I say, well, what are some of your tools? When you're 22 years old, you're probably not married. You probably don't have a mortgage. You probably don't have any kids. So you can work 8 to 6 Monday through Friday. But guess what? You probably still have some energy on Saturday and Sunday. What if you built something joyful into your time one Saturday or one Sunday for 3 or 4 hours, maybe even something we could consider a side hustle, something joyful you're passionate about and maybe could make you some money? And what if you did that for 6 months? Well, after 6 months, if you made some money, maybe you could start working 9 to 5 instead of 8 to 6. Maybe you could start working Monday through Thursday instead of Monday through Friday. Maybe you could scale up that side hustle and get rid of that horrible 8 to 6 to start with. And now you've done the joy of addition, right? You've used these tools like your energy and your time and your passions. And then you've used the joy of addition. But because you've used the joy of addition, you can start using the art of subtraction, which is getting rid of parts of your 8 to 6 you don't like. So it all goes together. But let's also say after 6 months, you do all this and you don't make any money. Well, your life is still better because you spent 3 or 4 hours a week doing something joyful. So you use the art of addition, even though you couldn't use any of the rest. And so it's kind of a win-win game. And so again, using those different tools we have available to us, using those 3 levers, how can we create a life in which more of our time is filled with purposeful activities and less of our time is filled with activities we don't like, or activities we loathe for that matter?
This episode of Richer Soul is sponsored by the Profit Answer Man podcast. If you're a business owner who wants to scale and grow, increase profits, or want to have strategic conversations around your financials, then check out the podcast. You'll learn how to work less, increase cash flow, increase profits, and build reserves to help you weather storms. It's built on the Profit First methodology of pay yourself first. The Profit Answer Man podcast is a must listen to for every small business owner and anyone who wants to help them survive and thrive. Check it out on your favorite listening platform. And I'm a big fan of subtraction. I have found subtraction actually brings more happiness than addition. Getting rid of the things that bug you all the time is far more powerful than adding more stuff to cover up the thing that's bugging you all the time.
I think that's true. And, one of the really amazing things about the art of subtraction is it just creates space and time. And so when you use the art of subtraction, you create space and time, a lot of times addition doesn't feel painful. It feels joyful, right? So I was doing this thing. I didn't like it. I took it off my plate. I now have a little free time. I have more bandwidth. And hey, there's this other thing I always wanted to do. And now I can do it. And that's kind of the way I think about it, is it benefits you on so many different levels.
And it does. And you have to be purposeful with that and make the shift on how you do those types of things. And I know for me, we've made a lot of shifts over the years and probably continue to do so. So let's talk about the concept of the climb. And it's basically, right, a framework to help us understand how to take everything we've discovered about our little p purpose and apply it to building a happier and healthy life. So what is this concept of the climb?
So as I was talking about before, when we're talking about finding purpose, we're really talking about recognizing these purpose anchors in our life. And so that's kind of what people really stumble on. But just recognizing this purpose anchor isn't enough. You then have to build a life of purpose around it. And that's what I call the climb. That's engaging in different activities surrounding these purpose anchors. That creates that sense of purpose. It creates that sense of busyness, of filling your time, of enjoying the process of doing these things you like to do. So again, I give my own life as examples because it's easy. I know I love to communicate, right? Communicating is important for me. It's exciting for me. I get lots of joy out of doing it. So I know that for me, communicating and having big conversations was an anchor, but then I had to create a life around that. Well, how did I do that? I started a podcast. I didn't make that podcast based on how many downloads I'd get or how famous I'd be or even how much money I'd make. It was based on there's this thing I love doing. So, how can I build these activities into my life that allow me to do that more of my day? Podcasting. Another one is writing books. I like communicating. I've had all these great conversations on my podcast and with my hospice patients and with personal finance people. I love the process of writing books. I get so excited when I sit down, I turn on the classical music, I have an outline or an idea of what I want to say, and then I just start writing. And it feels, don't get me wrong, it can be stressful at times, but it also feels joyful. So, this is that idea of the climb. It is purpose in action, and it has a lot of the same characteristics as little p purpose. So your climb shouldn't be goal oriented, right? Your climbs are only as good as the activity that you enjoy doing. So if you're doing your climb and it's not fun anymore, then it's probably not worthwhile. Your climb should be difficult to fail. It's hard to fail at podcasting, except you decide you don't want to do it anymore. But you connect to your mic and you turn it on and you record, you're basically doing it, right? And so there's this real abundance there. And the idea behind the climb is once one climb gets tiring or exhausting or you're not enjoying the process anymore, you quit it. You stop doing it and you start on a new climb. And so that's that idea. It's just the process of actually building activities you like around those purpose anchors.
You know why I have a podcast?
Why?
Because writing and editing drive me up the wall. I don't have to do that.
But it's great, right? Because you had an anchor. And for you, the anchor was to either talk about personal finance or help people with businesses or to teach in general. But then you got to pick and choose how to build your climb around that anchor. And you could have started writing, and then one day you could have been like, this makes me want to pull my hair out. And so you stopped doing that. And maybe you put up a microphone, connected, and said, well, how does this feel? And you started doing that, and either you really liked it and you're like, oh, this feels so much better than doing it another way. And so you stuck with that. And I'm sure when you started doing this, you might have said, look, I've got some goals. I'd like to create a business. I'd maybe even like to make some money, or maybe I'd like people to hear this and it helped them. But my bet is that there was some innate joy in the doing that pulled you through those times when the goals were far away. There were times when you're like, you know what, no one's listening. But hey, I'm digging having these deep conversations. I'm meeting cool people, and that makes it worthwhile. And then there were other times when you hit your goals and you could get excited by that, but you knew goals are transitory. Ultimately, you do the things you do because they fill you up. And I know I've known you, Rocky, long enough, and I know you've been doing this podcast long enough. If this was a goal-centered climb for you, you probably would have stopped a while ago. My guess is there's some real joy in just the doing.
There is. Actually, when I had pivoted probably about 5 years ago, one of the business coaches that I talked to were like, oh, yeah, you need to get rid of that because it's no longer serving you. I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. I enjoy this. I don't care if it's going to drive money or not drive money. And when I started it with the goal that, hey, I'm going to do this because I enjoy it, because I want to do this. And I don't care how many listeners come along.
Notice how you said that. I started with the goal and then you started describing process. You didn't start, I started with goal that I'd sell this much business, or I started with the goal I'd get this many downloads. What you really said is, I'm going to enjoy it, which means your goal was to enjoy the process, which defines little p purpose.
Yeah. And so it's been fun, which kind of brings up this next question, and you talk about it. How do I remain the hero of my journey, regardless of which way the path twists and turns?
Well, there's two ways to look at that. First and foremost, when we're talking about being the hero of the journey, we're really talking about meaning, and meaning is how we cognitively think about the past. So by nature, it's not about the present and future, it's about the past. But I will tell you, what I personally have found is most happy people tell them heroic stories about the past, and most unhappy people tell themselves victim stories about the past. But what actually happened to them doesn't even matter. Like there's this thing called lived experience. So I know people who had horrible childhoods where people died or they were beaten or hurt or crimes were committed against them. And then I know people who had childhoods in middle class America where they had little things go wrong, but no major trauma, no major illness, no major anything. The person who had that idyllic childhood feels their traumas no less than the person who suffered through death and disability and dismemberment and all those bad things. We only know the trauma we've lived through. And so I can't look at someone else and say, wow, you had it so bad, so I'm okay. Most of the time, we actually have to retell ourselves a story about that trauma we lived through, whether it was major or minor, and decide that it served us somehow or that we came out of it better than we were before. And so the most healthy people I know who've gone through quote unquote major trauma will tell you, I would have never chosen to go through that. Like me and you both lost parents when we were young. I would have never chosen to go through that. But what I've become today was intimately connected to that. And I'm proud of who I am today. I couldn't have been here unless I had dealt with that. And I've become a stronger, more able person to do it. So I don't worry about the future. Like I said, purpose is about the present and future. Just do what you like. As time goes on, what's more important is the stories you tell yourself about those things you did. And again, people who tend to be happy tend to tell themselves good stories about what they've been through, positive or negative.
And I didn't ask you the question today because you've been on twice before, but we always ask about childhood and growing up and learning about money. And sometimes we'll even go into a deeper conversation. Okay, that's what you experienced. How'd your siblings turn out? And it's like, oh, they didn't put the same meaning to that story or to that upbringing that I did. They viewed it from their point of view, which for me was like a major aha. What do you mean everyone doesn't think the way I do? Of course, everyone thinks this way. And I think that's a big part of it is we all get to choose how we react to the situation at hand. And you have to realize that.
Yeah, and even for people who don't have that great sense of meaning. So you have two brothers, they both underwent the same traumas during childhood. One is happy and feels the world is good and is surviving and thriving. The other looks at his past, feels like a victim and can never quite make ends meet. The answer for that brother who feels like a victim is to get therapy. They call it narrative therapy, to go back, look at those stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, separate ourselves from the bad things that happened to us, realize maybe I was a good guy in a bad situation instead of being a bad kid, and then rewriting those narratives in much more positive ways. And I think that's much more connected to allowing yourself to be happy than necessarily what you achieve in your present and future. And this is why I think Big P purpose is so misaligned with our needs. Is a lot of people want to skip that meaning step and just achieve something big and it's going to fix everything. And it just doesn't.
We're going to come back to that in a second. But before we do, I don't realize how much people don't understand this next part. Financial incentives turn awful joyful activities into loathsome ones. And you go to do something because it's fun, then you turn it into a business or a money-making activity. And then the next thing you know, all the fun goes away.
Yeah, I talk about this in my book, Taking Stock, but it's a parable or a story about this exact phenomena. And it's about the old guy who lives at the end of the street with the pristine lawn. A lot of us grew up on a street like this. So imagine that there's an old man, has this wonderful lawn, and there are a bunch of kids who love to play football on the block. And he spends all day tidying and cleaning up. But the minute he goes inside, those kids extend their football game onto his lawn. And it drives him crazy. He then has to come back out, fix everything up. He yells at him, with them, he pleads, but the minute he disappears, they do the same thing over and over again. But this guy's smart and understands something about behavioral theory. So he goes and uses exactly what you just talked about. He goes to the kids and he says, you know what? I've changed my mind and I think you playing on the lawn is actually good for the lawn. It fertilizes it. It's really good. I'm going to pay you $10 a week for each of you to play on my lawn. Now the kids are overjoyed, right? Not only do they get to play football, which is what they want to do in the first place, but now they have $10 to go spend on candy. So the guy waits a week and then he turns the screws on him. He comes back, he says, you know what, you're not doing a very good job. My lawn is no better than I thought it would be. I'm not going to pay you $10 anymore, but I'll pay you $5. And let's give it a few days and see how it goes. Now the kids are a little bit less overjoyed. They were like, I was getting $10, I'm only getting 5, but we still like playing football. And it's still better. I can still use that $5 to go buy candy. So they play on the lawn for another few days. And then finally the old man comes back to him and says, you know what, you're doing a lousy job. The lawn looks no better. I'm not paying you any money anymore. You can play on the lawn as much as you want, but I'm not giving you another cent. And the kids, of course, look at him, fuming in rage, and they say, you know what? We are never playing on your lawn again, no matter how much you beg us. They turn around, walk away, and never play on his lawn again. The moral of the story is sometimes when we receive external rewards like money for things we're highly internally motivated to do, it actually kills our internal motivation.
And I was reading a book, and it was about giving raises to people. And it basically said people do things for their intrinsic value. And when you start to give them raises and overpay them, they lose the intrinsic part. And quality of work goes down dramatically because you paid them too much and they no longer have that intrinsic desire to get it done.
Yeah, a lot of the stuff is Daniel Pink's autonomy, mastery, and purpose, right? And so what keeps us engaged in things gives us the internal motivation and helps us not burn out. And a lot of that is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And unfortunately, often there are these outside forces that impinge on those, right? So doctors often struggle with those because they lose autonomy. Or when we talk about purpose, all of a sudden they're incentivized to take certain behaviors and not others. And it kind of kills that internal motivation.
It does. Now, I was kind of surprised at this because towards the end of the book, you say meaning and purpose are not the goal. Happiness is not the goal. What you really want is for connections and community. That kind of came out of left field there.
So a lot of this also stems from this argument that money can buy happiness. And we've all heard this, right? If you've been in personal finance at all, there are 2 or 3 major studies, right? The first one was Kahneman and Deaton, right? Kahneman and Deaton did this study, basically said, you know what? Money increases happiness up to making about $70,000 a year. Now, this was in, 2010. So inflation adjust if you like. But after $70,000 a year, it doesn't make you happy anymore. And then this guy, Matthew Killingsworth, did a different set of studies and said, you know what, you're wrong. For some people, increased money does increase happiness, and it continues to rise the more money they make. Eventually, Killingsworth and Kahneman looked at the data together and came up with similar ideas that, maybe money does increase happiness for some people. The thing about it is when you look at their data, it was based on limited data sets, studying people for short periods of time. And usually it was data that was collected for something else that they randomized. Or in the Killingsworth case, it was like text that they sent to people for multiple days in a row for a few weeks and then stopped. And they only did one assessment of their income. I'd rather look at something called the Harvard Adult Development Study. It started, I think, in the 1920s. It's been running for over 70 years. And the Harvard Developmental Study not only did questionnaires every 2 years, but looked at income. They did MRIs, they did EEGs, they drew blood. They started with Harvard graduates, but then got about 1,500 family members involved. And then eventually they got a bunch of controls from the Boston area. And if you look at the Harvard study, after all these years, when they looked at happiness, they found that it was not related to income. It was not related to prestige. It was not related to your job title. What they actually found was that it was related to interpersonal relationships, what I would call community and connections. And so when I got to the end of this book, I realized it isn't even purpose. The studies do show that purpose increases health, longevity, and happiness. But I think the way they do that is purpose leads to connections and community. When you are doing what lights you up, you tend to draw other people to you, and you become teacher and student. You become mentors and mentees. You work on projects together, and ultimately you build a community around yourself involved in something you love. And I think that's actually what leads to the increased happiness and all those good things that happen. It's not just purpose, it's purpose that connects you to other people. And I think that is, in essence, what little p purpose does. I don't think big p purpose does it in the same way. If my goal in life is to become president, I don't know how many people that's going to connect me to. In fact, it may cause me to be unfriendly with people who are then working against me because they want to be president. But if my goal is to be the world's happiest podcaster and have great conversations, I'm going to connect to people like you who are fellow podcasters. I'm going to connect to my guests that I have on the show, and I'm going to connect to my listeners, and we're going to collaborate and build things together. And hopefully I'll build a community around me that ultimately delivers the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, which is that kind of happy connectedness.
You know, one of the biggest ahas I got from the study was every 10 years, how differently people looked at life. And a lot of times it was 180s, and they didn't realize they had done a 180. They forgot what they said 10 years ago, and the way they looked at it going forward was totally different. And yes, I mean, they did statistical analysis, and relationships was one of the only correlations to kind of happiness.
And you think about the durability of the study and how aggressively they study people. They even interviewed their family members every few years. And so this is why, me personally, I don't put much into the whole kind of Kahneman Killingsworth studies, just because when we look at the detail that went into the Harvard study, that speaks volumes. And I guess they kind of study slightly different things, but I think we can connect them.
No, very true. One of the things that I really enjoyed in the book is pretty much at the end of each chapter, you had action items. So not only did you explain what to do, but you actually got people to take action on them. And I found that seems to be a newer trend in a lot of books, is they combine the theory and the behind the scenes, but then here's what you do about it, and here's how you can move forward. What prompted you to do that?
Well, I think this is always a problem in these big theoretical books, right? This is a theory philosophy based book, which sounds great, but if you can't then take the 1,000-foot view and bring it down to actionable, tactical experience activities today, then I've probably added to the confusion. So I like to end each chapter with those tactical experiences, because it's like, okay, we've talked about the philosophy. Now let's talk about how you can actually bring this into your life today. And so for me, I feel it's really important to just kind of bring it down to your current average everyday life and away from some of the philosophy. I don't think we can move forward without the philosophy, but I think it's just one piece.
That makes a lot of sense. You told a lot of stories in the book. Did you have a favorite?
The favorite story for me is the opening story, which is about Roman in the baseball card store, because it changed my life. That one comes up over and over again. And the other story that really comes up over and over again is the one about my maternal grandfather, because we talk about generational growth, which is something I don't really hear people talk about. We often talk about generational trauma, how our parents and grandparents leave a legacy that causes behaviors that don't serve us. But my goal in this book was not only to say you should pursue little p purpose because it'll make you happy and it's good for you, but to make the argument that your impact in the world will be greater than with bigger p purpose. And the bridge to that is what it's called generational growth. And that kind of story of my maternal grandfather and how he affected my life 60 years later, even though he died before I was born, shows to me the strength and the power of little p purpose.
Nice. Is there anything we should have chatted about but didn't get a chance to?
I think with that last discussion, generational growth, I think, is a key concept in the book. And to make it very straightforward, a lot of people go after big P purpose because they think that's the only way they're going to have impact or legacy. That's the way they're going to change the world. But I tell several stories in the book about how people doing the things that light them up has consequences, often unintended, that actually changes the world and probably in a more durable way. So in the beginning of the book, I talk about Roman, who owned an antique store and found his little p purpose in selling baseball cards. And in so doing, accidentally created a community that I joined when I was very young. And my father had just died and I had a learning disability and I was really kind of nerdy and I had no friends. And he unwittingly created a community that changed my life. It gave me confidence. It helped me find my people and friendships. It made me believe in myself. Because of that, I eventually became a doctor. I eventually became successful. All these things happened because of him. And so he wasn't trying to change the world. You know, his goal was not to have big impact, but 30 years later, he died of cancer a long time ago. And yet I'm still talking about him because he changed my life. And this is what happens, I believe, when we pursue little p purpose. His goal was not to change my life. He just realized he loved baseball and baseball cards and decided to turn his antique store into a shop that also sold baseball cards.
I think the biggest thing is, instead of trying to change the world, change yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And change yourself and do important things, and the world will change in positive ways around you.
That it will.
It's time to learn the secrets of life.
What's your secret to living an abundant life?
I think for me, abundance is about pursuing things that light you up. So my version of abundance is little p purpose because it has allowed me the ability to find a million different things that I like. And my biggest problem is not finding things I like. It's narrowing down which ones I'm going to do in the day because there's so many of them.
Well, and that's a great place to be, where you have so much you want to do that you actually have to choose, versus people who are like, oh, there's nothing good to do. What did you learn later in life that you wish you would have learned sooner?
Man, I learned that money is a little bit of a mirage and we spend a lot of time worrying about money. And instead of focusing on that, we should just look at it as a tool to do more important, cool stuff.
And it is a tool. And unfortunately, nobody teaches you how to use it as a tool. It's not what's taught in school. If you were to give an 18-year-old one specific piece of wisdom, what would it be?
It's going to sound like it contradicts itself, but it doesn't, because I would give you two. I'd say put purpose first, right? Think about purpose before you build your financial future, but also you're 18, start investing. Because the power of compounding is so powerful. If you do want to have a lot of that tool of money and you start at 18, it's a lot easier when you get to 30 and 40 and 50.
And that is true. The math is unbelievable. And you can start small and end up with big results. And what that actually does, though, is give you the financial freedom to pursue whatever it is you want to. And you don't have to wait till you're 65. You can even at 22 go, hey, I've saved a little bit of money. I have the freedom to take 6 months off. Or you just got to figure it out for you and make it work your way.
Most definitely.
If people would like to learn more about you in the book, how do they do that?
So you can find my book wherever books are sold. If you're interested online, you can go to Amazon. It should be in most bookstores. But if you have any problems with that, go to jordangrumet.com. That's JORDANGRUMET.com. There you will find links to both of my books, as well as the other places where I produce content, including my Substack, my financial blog, and my podcast.
Awesome. We'll make sure to put that in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. This was a blast.
Jordan's book just released as this episode is going live, so you can read it too. Let me ask you a question. Do you have a reason for your life? A small p purpose? Something you love to do regardless of the money or what others think? Good part of my life has been like that, as is this podcast. We're now starting year 9 of the podcast, and we publish every single week without fail. I can tell you I've grown over time, and the first 9 episodes still stand, as we talked about last week. I'm sure you've learned more but the core hasn't changed. This is how you live that life, and you have fun. By the way, if you know someone who would appreciate this episode, would you do me a favor and share it with them? Thank you so much. Next week, we've got my friend Dave on. We're going to talk about creating an intentional life focus right along with this theme. Thanks for listening. Have an abundant week.